Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome, everyone, or good afternoon, I suppose, or evening, depending where you are in the globe. Thank you for joining the Local Public Sector Alliance, the Forum of Federations, and DLOG for this webinar, Local Governance Indicators, the Global State of Knowledge. My name is Charles Cadwell. While my day job is as an Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute, I'm very happy to be on the board of the Local Public Sector Alliance, LPSA, and to be the moderator of today's event. I am confident that I'm not alone in facing questions where I don't have a simple answer. And in the decentralization and local government part of my life, this is certainly the case. How many local governments should a country have? What's the right number? Why shouldn't we have local government just the way people in name your rich country do things? How much should we decentralize? Many local governments don't perform well. Why should we entrust them with more responsibility? If we could simply give local governments more money, a fair share of the national revenue, wouldn't local government be the best to fix things? Since you joined us today, you know that the reality is a lot more complex than those questions. But at the end of the day, decisions do need to be made about how many local governments, who pays, who decides, using what rules. And if there's not one template for a successful local government or the extent of desirable decentralization or the mechanisms of multi-level governance, then how do we actually know how to help people set priorities or to advise them? The widely shared intuition that the local provision of public goods and services can be more responsive to local preferences and needs has a lot of conditions that go along with it. How democratic is local government? How are local efforts funded? And what strings come with that funding? The indicators we're going to talk about today are each efforts to understand the wide variety of local democracy and local administration around the globe. These are among the issues that the Local Public Sector Alliance was formed to raise up. We're a new organization, formally organized only in February of this year, but led by Jamie Boex and Serdar Yilmaz and others with decades of laboring in this garden. So our goal is to fill a gap and foster the community of practice that combines both academic expertise and on-the-ground practicality and relevance to the challenges of local government. Today's event is co-sponsored by two important partners, the Forum of Federations based in Toronto and with branches around the globe, and DLOG, the Development Partners Network on Decentralization and Local Governance, which is a network of 40-some bilateral and multilateral donors based in Bonn. Both organizations play an important role in helping elevate the debate around these issues. We're also lucky today to have three experts who are leading these cutting-edge efforts to understand the role of local government. They're doing this by collecting and generating data on various attributes of intergovernmental systems in multiple countries. So let me ask our three panelists to unmute themselves and turn on their cameras while Jamie puts the links to their bios in the chat. I guess I'll start in the order you're appearing on my screen. Alexander Bastianin is at the University of Lausanne, where working with Professor Andreas Ladner, he has overseen the construction of the Local Autonomy Index 2, which is a comprehensive measure of local autonomy in 39 European countries. And its newest iteration gets more deeply into issues of multi-level governance of particular interest to me. Paolo Dardanelli is at the University of Kent and has constructed the D/Centralization Dataset, which is measuring decentralization in 6 major federations, Australia, Canada, Germany, India, Switzerland, and the US, and is now being extended to 5 federations in the global south. Kelly McMahon is a professor of political science at Case Western University here in the US. And she leads the subnational indicators project of V-Dem, the Varieties of Democracy Dataset. As many of you will know, V-Dem is headed by a consortium of principal investigators based at University of Gothenburg. We're also fortunate to have 2 discussants who I will invite to join the conversation a little later. Philip Gonzalez from the Forum of Federations. He heads their Asia-Australia office in Melbourne, where it's the middle of the night. And I thank Philip for getting up or staying up to join us. And also Benjamin Oliete, who's from DLOG, the donor working group, and based in Germany. Our challenge today is to use our time efficiently to describe these wide-ranging indicator efforts and consider how they help policymakers and practitioners, those of us who would advise policymakers and those who try to assess whether local government's delivering the goods. So I've asked each of our experts to be prepared to answer 4 questions that I will come to in a moment. Each of these indices is not identical. These indices are not identical, and they're each formed for a different purpose and collect some different data, but they all share the characteristic of adding insights about local government in the world or parts of the world. And so I'm looking forward to learning more about each of them. So the 4 topics I want to help all of us hear about are quickly this. First of all, what's the problem we're trying to solve when we set out to measure local governance or government? Second, I'll ask each of our panelists to briefly describe what they're collecting and putting into the index and scoring. We all should know that each of these indices have a lot of people and a lot of work that would take a long time to describe in detail. And if you want to sign up for the master's course, we'll have to schedule another event. Third question is, when you settled on this approach, what did you not do? What did you leave on the cutting room floor or decide was either too difficult or not so relevant? And then finally, and perhaps most importantly to people in our audience today, who's using the data and what does it help them do better? I've got a raft of other questions, but I'm going to try to be quiet myself and let our discussants lead that. But during the conversation we're about to have, our speakers will be able to discuss these among themselves as well. So with that, we have a lot to cover, so let's get started. And on our program, Kelly, you're listed first, so maybe you could just tell us on the subnational portion of the V-Dem effort, what were you trying to sort out? What's the problem you were addressing with your subnational indicators?
Great, so thank you, Chaz. So for the subnational indicators themselves, the big advance is that there wasn't, prior to V-Dem, a global data set that actually looked at the subnational level. So for the subnational indicators in particular, that's the big difference. But V-Dem also overall, including the subnational indicators, makes a number of advances. And I'm going to share a slide here that just lists those advances, and I'll speak briefly to them. So you should be able to see a slide now. So compared to data sets that existed about 10 years ago when we, a team of us from around the world began this project, V-Dem, first of all, takes a multidimensional approach to understanding democracy and regime type. And that really was our overarching goal, was to provide improved data on democracy, but more broadly regime type. So it's multidimensional in the sense that we're looking at different understandings of democracy: electoral, liberal, participatory, egalitarian, and deliberative. Also, we disaggregate the concept of democracy or regime type into 483 indicators, which is considerably more than the 1 or 2 indicators that was available per data set before. So we're looking at all political institutions and rights that are a part of regime types or democracy specifically. We ask very specific questions to capture the data for those 483 indicators. We cover 179 of the 195 countries in the world, really just excluding small island countries. Another advance for V-Dem was how far back in time we go. So the data go back, all the data go back to 1900, some of the indicators go back as far as 1789. Also, this isn't a project that you have experts sitting in New York or London gathering the data or sharing their opinions. Instead, we use a very inclusive, very local, decentralized approach to collecting data. For each of our indicators, we have 5 country experts, most of whom are nationals of the country that they're coding. They typically have doctorates in political science and work in universities or think tanks. And then we have a measurement model that aggregates their responses across the 5 experts per indicator into a single response. We're very transparent about our methodology. We have country coders indicate how confident they are in their responses, and that information is available to the data users. We also reveal how much disagreement there is among experts when they're responding to the same question. The data are free on the internet to everyone, so the data are very accessible. And as I began my remarks with, the key advance relevant to this group is that this is the first global data set to look at democracy and government subnationally. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Paulo, you've got your own extensive set of indicators you've assembled, but can you, why'd you do that? What was the issue you were helping all of us address?
Yeah, thank you, Chas, and hello, everyone. Yeah, so the main problem that we try to address is how we measure decentralization. You know, we are all familiar with you know, statements to the effect that one country is centralized, the other country is decentralized. But how do we compare this? That was the fundamental problem that you know, got us going. And we focus in particular. We were particularly interested in federations. In federations, of course. The relationship between the state, the provincial level, and the central level is absolutely the heart of the political system. So we focus in particular on federations, and we said, okay, how can we measure this in a way that we can compare between different countries and over time? So that was really, you know, the essence of what we try to do. And so then we started thinking about, you know, what is decentralization? What are the dimensions? What are the properties? So we try to conceptualize it and then measure it across different dimensions. So, I mean, I can say a little bit more later, perhaps in answering your second question about, you know, how we did it. But in essence, that is what we try to do. And also measuring over the entire lifespan of federations, in the sense that there have been many studies, of course, they look at a particular point in time. For example, let's say decentralization in Latin America, you know, towards the end of the 20th century. That's a snapshot. We wanted to put that, you know, in the context over the long run. So that's, in essence, what we try to do.
Super, thank you. And I know that for each of these metrics we're talking about today, there's a raft of articles and authors and others who are using the data to do studies. But we're looking to learn a little bit about that, but also about how they're used by policymakers and people on the ground. Alexander, with your local autonomy version 2, you're capturing information on, I think it's like 39 countries, but what prompted the interest in that?
Right, so thank you. Just to correct you and also to start back on the whole history. So the first iteration of the Local Autonomy Index covered 39 countries, and now we currently cover 57 countries. But this is a good segue into starting what problems we're actually trying to solve, because it's a very pragmatic starting point. We basically, so Andreas Ladner and Nicholas Käufer, who are also 2 members of the leading house on this project, they started by answering a call for tender that was sent out in 2014 by the Directorate General for Regional and Urban Policy at the European Commission, because the European Commission wanted a comprehensive self-rule index of local authorities for all European countries. So the quick answer would be, we answered this call. And then the second iteration of the project was basically to do the same, but to provide a more precise coding scheme with more detail, to include more countries and to update it until 2020. So we cover countries, 57 countries from 1990 to 2020, with a whole list of variables that really encapsulate in a very comprehensive way what local autonomy looks like, based on what is found in the literature and based on expert opinions from the country group coordinators that are also involved at a certain point in our project.
Before I move to the second question, let me ask each of you or any of you, implicit in what we're talking about here is the idea that somehow more decentralization or more autonomy is better. Or is that not implicit in the work you're doing? I guess my own experience is that there's several places I'm working where it seems that things are too decentralized and the local bodies responsible lack resources or tax revenue or sometimes capacity, but my experience is people are pretty capable if they're given discretion. But what's what is a good score? What constitutes a good score? Or is that the wrong question? But I'll just go ahead, Kelly. You can start, I guess.
So when I was designing the subnational indicators for V-Dem, I intentionally decided not to try to capture decentralization. I mean, we are looking obviously to see if there's local and regional government as a starting point for measuring democracy at those levels. But you can have very democratic decentralized systems and very democratic unitary systems. So for my purposes, I intentionally wasn't trying to capture decentralization with this.
Paolo, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, we try to, I mean, as I guess everyone is familiar with, I mean, we hear much more about decentralization than centralization. And, our starting point is that, of course, there are two sides of the same coin. In the sense is something is highly decentralized, is low on centralization, and vice versa. And this use of decentralization, of course, as you said, Charles, is sort of, betrays, if you want, a normative standpoint whereby decentralization is good, centralization is bad. I mean, so we are trying to avoid this, and our use of the term D/centralization implies that we are looking at movements, obviously, in both directions. That said, if you take federations, I mean, of course, federations, they are based on the idea that the component units have a degree of autonomy. And if that autonomy goes away, if we think of the extreme, if that autonomy goes away, then the system ceases to be a federation. So in a way, if we are interested in federalism, we care about federalism, then we can have obviously more or less centralized systems, but they limit beyond which the system ceases to be a federation. And in some other work that I've done on European countries, we can see our systems in some cases move from being unitary to federal and vice versa. So we haven't done it in this, wider study, but if you want, it's there on the background.
And so, Alexander, if I score highly on autonomy too, am I better or worse off?
Well, the thing is, so in general, one could say that more autonomy is better, but also it's important to grasp the complexity of local autonomy. There's many parts of it. It's not only financial resources, it's not only the ability to levy your own taxes, but it's also what kind of policies are you allowed to act on. If you have a lot of resources, but the central government tells you can't act on health or on public transport or on education, then you're not really acting in a local way. And also to have legal autonomy or to have constitutional protection of your municipalities, or even the autonomy to organize your municipalities in the way you see best fit. So it's a very complex part. And in our index, so we deconstruct all of these components and indicators. So you can definitely see where the scores are not met, and then based on those scores, you could probably think, well, where are the areas we can improve? Because maybe high scoring countries are functioning better on legitimacy or on proximity with citizens, or even on the efficiency of local service delivery. But then there's always some paths in some areas where you can improve, and this index is more of a way to see where improvements can be made or what needs to be changed in order to improve. We're not saying we actually provide solutions, but we provide a way of understanding where autonomy can be improved.
Mm-hmm. Super. So that my next thing I think I'd like to move to is some description of what you're actually collecting, as briefly as can be done. So without reading off all 50 indicators, or how many, what, 400 and something? But describe what it is you're collecting and how you're, what sort of scoring you're doing. But maybe, Kelly, if you could focus on the subnational parts of V-Dem, it would be great.
Sure. So of the 483 V-Dem indicators, 19 are focused on the subnational level. Those indicators capture what's going on at 2 levels of government, and those are identified by the country experts. So what we call a regional level and a local level. So for 75% of the countries in the world, we're capturing all their subnational levels. For the other 25%, they tend to have 3 levels instead of 2 levels. And we have our country experts choose of the 3 possible ones to choose which to have the most responsibilities. So at those 2 levels, we're looking at averages and distributions and outliers. And we're focused on 3 topics, and those topics are elections, civil liberties, and authority and constraints. Hopefully you can see my slide.
Yes.
So to give you an example, so for an average for subnational elections, we ask, to what extent are subnational elections free and fair? And again, this would be every year back in time. An example of a distribution question is, to what extent is the freeness, to what extent does the freeness and fairness of subnational elections vary within the country? And then finally, for outliers, we ask, identify the areas of the country with significantly less free and fair elections, with significantly more free and fair elections, and identify from a list of characteristics what is shared among that group that has more free and fair elections and that group that has less free and fair elections. So we do something, we do something similar for civil liberties. And then we also have some questions about authority and constraints, because even if you have elected offices at the subnational levels, and even if you do have free and fair elections backed up by civil liberties that help them be free and fair elections, you still need to make sure that those elected offices have authority to act, and that they can have some measure of constraint over the unelected offices. So that's why I, with input from my other V-Dem colleagues, selected those 3 topics.
Super, thank you very much. My colleague Jamie Boex uses the phrase DINO, decentralization in name only, and I think that's what you're hinting at there. Paolo, what data are you collecting?
Yes, so we for the first phase, those 6 countries that you mentioned earlier, we looked at 2 main dimensions: policy and fiscal. So for policy dimension, we distinguish between legislation and administration, in the sense that we looked at which level, passes legislation, which level sets the legal framework for the regulation of a particular area, and which area runs things on the ground. So for example, in the case of education, who sets the key legislation about education, who runs the schools. So we did that, we distinguished in those two sub-dimensions, and we looked at 22 policy areas from agriculture to transport. This is for the policy dimension. And then in the fiscal dimension, we have 5 indicators. The main one is the proportion of own source revenues. So what is the proportional revenue that a state or a province has on which they have control of the base and rate? And then there are 4 other fiscal indicators. For the second phase of the project, where we looked at these global South countries, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, and Pakistan, we are also, because these are, of course, countries that they've experienced different regime types. They had the periods of authoritarianism and periods of democracy. So we are also looking, in a similar way to what Kelly was saying earlier, we are looking at the what we call political institutional dimension. So we look at the constitutional autonomy. Do the units have the power to set up their own sort of order, constitutional order? Do they have elected institutions or not? So then we can track over time, for example, whether authoritarian rulers suppress the institution at the state provincial level or not. And then we have a measure of electoral manipulation. So again, this is similar in a way to what Kelly and her colleagues have done. But when it comes to manipulation, our particular focus is on whether they are manipulated from the center. So whether, for example, in situations of authoritarianism, whether the central government attempts to control, manipulate, the electoral process at the state provincial level.
Well, and you're also suggesting, though, that there's not every function is decentralized in the same degree. So agriculture may be more or less than education, than health.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is certainly the case across all systems. You see a huge difference. Of course, you have areas like defense or currency and money supply. These are typically either entirely fully centralized or almost fully centralized. And then you have primary education, which is a classic area that is decentralized. So you have a lot of diversity across policy areas. So this is precisely,
are you capturing
precisely what we wanted to capture. Yeah.
Are you capturing the de jure or the de facto?
Well, we try as much as possible of capturing the de facto situation, which obviously incorporated the de jure setup of what is the letter of the law is. But often again, for example, in situations of authoritarian regimes or hybrid regime, there might be a significant gap between the letter of the law and what is going on the ground. So as much as possible, we try to capture what is going on the ground.
Yeah, no, with a colleague, I was recently looking at the issue of decentralization in Nepal and the so-called shared powers and exclusive powers, and there's lots of the distance between de jure and de facto. Alexander, in your calling your index or your indicators autonomy, you must be into the middle of this. But what are you actually collecting?
Well, in a nutshell, to keep it quite short for this whole webinar, we collect 11 components of local autonomy, which we call variables. So 11 variables, 8 of them are self-rule variables and 3 of them interactive rule variables. These go from policy scope, political discretion, organizational autonomy, fiscal autonomy, legal protection, and so on and so on. These are all aggregations of various indicators that the code books that we provide in various publications and on our website, you can go into detail. These are then all aggregated in these 11 components, which are then put together into 7 dimensions, which these dimensions help to theoretically put a certain weight on every component of local autonomy, because not all of these components have the same importance. And then these the 7 dimensions are then combined into what we call the local autonomy index itself. Now, all of these components have various indicators, as I mentioned, for example, policy scope, which basically describes in what policy fields the local authorities have certain responsibility, whether partial or full. You can go into things such as education and then go deeper into like preschool, primary school, secondary school, or public transport. You can divide it up to bus transport and railway transport. Again, these are all very detailed, and then they're aggregated at higher levels. So it's a pretty there's many different scores that if you look at the coding sheets that are available freely on the website, you can really go in depth in every score. And then also a very, very important part, and what we think is a very rich add-on to this index is not only we have these scores, but the experts who assess these scores, they have to fill in what we call a country profile, which is basically a report where they have to explain the contextual factors of the country, provide justifications, whether it's legal bases or in case of de facto assessments, base themselves as much as on the reality as possible. And then, of course, every score has to be justified for quality reasons. So you can really see if there's an evolution somewhere over the 30 years in this time series. You could actually find out in what area this change has occurred and why, if it's a specific reform or if it's a change, a political change or something else. So it's really to be as transparent as possible as well in the ways of justifying these scores, because just providing a general index wouldn't be a solid design.
Right, but in each case, with all three of these examples, you're relying on experts and some judgments that they make, and so I guess a question before I move on is how do we assure over time, as experts change, or even our perceptions, even looking backwards at some places change, that the if you've got the transparent set of indicators and you're disclosing who your experts are, that still leaves our judgments to our priorities to shift. And there's a implicit in each of these is an algorithm of some sort that says these components are important to the outcomes we hope to have from local government. But in fact, it's not an algorithm. It's our judgments about the key things that lead to the outcomes we hope government, including local government, is going to generate. And I think, well, to the extent that the local autonomy index in particular ranks people, but there's some implicit weighting, I guess, that goes on across these. Help us understand, I guess, in each case, whether you're coming up with an overall judgment or score, or do the indicators sort of sit on their own and get used separately? Should each country be aiming for a high score or focusing on the pieces? Kelly, your head's moving most, so I'll ask you first.
Okay, thanks, Chaz. So in terms of aggregation, there are different options as to how you want to use the V-Dem data, whether the data overall or the subnational data. So all the individual indicators are available to anyone with an internet connection, but we've also created 96 indices. So if you want to look at democracy level overall, you can use the Liberal Democracy Index. If you want to look at the freedom of the media, we have an index for that too. So there are different options. I'd also like to comment on this issue of experts using their judgment. So there are a couple different ways that we deal with that for V-Dem. One is to have very specific, detailed questions that can be very helpful. Another thing we do is people have different thresholds, different sort of scales in their minds that they're using. So we use bridge coding for V-Dem. So we have some of our experts who are experts about two very different countries. We'll code both of them so we can get a sense of what their scale is, and we adjust as we aggregate data, we adjust that in the measurement model to make sure everyone's working on the same scale, so we're not getting judgments done on different scales. And then finally, in terms of the really good point Chaz made about perceptions changing about the past, we do allow for retrospective coding. So for example, if there was a collapse of a regime, a year ago, and 5 years in the future, we learn more about it, coders can go back and adapt their scores based on what they've learned, what's been revealed, what they've found out from their research. I think the amount of that's done is pretty minimal, but that is an option. So that's how we deal with that issue as well.
Thank you. Paulo, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we use experts on the individual policy areas, for example, for the policies for each country. And then we try to aggregate, the country level and then across countries, because we obviously concerned with the comparability of scores, across countries. And so we do that. On the one hand, we use the policy experts, and then we use experts on the country as a whole. And then, within our team of researchers, we try to ensure comparability across countries. This is what we have done, and each coding decision that we have arrived at is fully documented, is up there on the internet, so can be accessed, and so we very much welcome corrections, as it were. So anyone who is an expert on any particular policy in any particular country at any particular point in time, they're very welcome to contact us if anything doesn't look right, and we'll correct it. I mean, in a way, this is the first step, in as you were saying, Charles, earlier, in a long journey. So we very much welcome input from experts, on all these topics. Yeah.
Alexander.
I would definitely join Paolo's statements. In our case, we also have very rich documentation for every assessment of every code for every country. So again, these data sheets, the coding sheets, as well as the country profiles are freely available. And you could definitely check for every year, for every feature of local autonomy, just check the scores and provide even your own assessment. So in that case, we believe that our scores are very much warranted. And on the data collection side of things, we, for every country, so for all 57 countries, we usually have pairs of experts. So there's always two different judgments. In certain cases, when there are smaller states and there's less local government units to assess, we might have only one expert. But then these countries are all assigned to a team of country group coordinators. So for every group of countries, whether these are regional groupings, let's say like the Nordic European countries or the Eastern European countries or other countries, these might be grouped by proximity geographically wise, or grouped in a different way. These coordinators, they all check the various tables and documents, and based on their expert judgment, they see if these scores are warranted or not, and they do not hesitate to amend scores based on other information they would find. And then after all these country group coordinators are done with their check, well, it also goes through a third check here at the leading house. So Andreas Ladner, Nicholas Käufer, and myself would go through all of these tables one last time to ensure that everything makes sense, and also to see if the scores that can be found in the country profiles in the reports are actually the same scores we find in the tables. These are all very important things, and details might be overlooked by one person, but I don't think that at 3 levels with multiple people per level, these details are overlooked. So in that case, it's a very a solid control system as well. Plus, on behalf of that, we've also sent out these results to external controllers who were not involved in the project. And in our case, we had partners, for example, at the OECD, who also checked scores for all of these countries. So there's even a 4th level of control in that case. And they provided us with reports on whether these scores are solid in the sense of component-wise, but also dimension-wise, and also the global index itself.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm keeping my eye on the clock and realizing we're running through our time, and I want to get our discussants in the room. So very quickly, for each of you, are there things as you've been developing these that you decided not to do, or for whatever reasons? And if you don't have an answer for that, that's fine, because I want to move to our 4th question pretty quickly. But let's just go through again. Kelly, Paolo, then Alexander.
Sure. So I wasn't able to replicate all the V-Dem indicators at the subnational level. Obviously, there could have been many more indicators than 19. The other thing is it just isn't feasible to collect data for individual subnational units for all countries of the world back to 1900, or in some cases even 1789. So instead, I used averages, distributions, and outliers. So those were some of the tough choices I had to make this feasible.
Well, then the number of people interested in the historical as opposed to what's happening today is a smaller number as well, so that the market for that might be less. Paulo.
Yes, well, I guess two main things that, in an ideal world that, we could have done. I mean, one is that, and I'm sort of somewhat embarrassed to say, in this particular webinar, is that we looked for that particular project at the state-federal relation. We didn't look at the state-local. So that's something that we haven't done. Ideally, it could be done, and this, I guess, is what also Alexander and his colleagues are also doing. And it could be a further development. It could be something to be done in the future, but we didn't do it in that particular project. Yep. The other thing that we didn't do is that we didn't look at federal and unitary countries. We focused only on federal countries. As I mentioned, in some other work that I've done, I looked for the European countries, federal and unitary, which is also interesting because obviously you have interesting patterns and dynamics of decentralization also in unitary countries.
Thank you. Alexander.
Right, in our case, you could always go into more detail. So the scores we have for every country, they are based on assessments that are made for municipalities or local government units, the lowest local government unit possible. And in the case of federal states, or in case where subnational units are justifiable, or where there's asymmetries also in the divisions of these, in the political divisions at the subnational level, we've done this. But again, that doesn't mean we could look at every single municipality. I mean, for our case, we're based in Switzerland. For Switzerland alone, you would have to look at more than 2,000 different municipalities. So there's definitely differences between these municipalities if you score them individually, but that's too much of an endeavor, given the fact that the tendered project of the European Commission only gave us 15 months to collect data for 57 countries. So we had to provide some kind of an aggregation solution, but you could always go into more detail, and things like urban-rural differences are definitely not reflected in our data because we have no way of finding that out with the time and the resources that we had.
Yeah, and for those of us who are doing work in individual countries, that's it's an important next step, I guess. But that raises for me this fourth and maybe the money question, and that's who's using this data and what's the impact? What are people doing better once they've got any of the data you're collecting? And we are running ahead of where I wanted to be, or behind where we wanted to be. So I want to get our discussants in the room, but let's this is important. So Kelly, if you could start, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. So the V-Dem data, including the specific subnational indicators, are being used by international governmental and advocacy agencies and organizations, national governments, and also the media. So just to give you some examples, the UN now includes V-Dem indicators to measure its sustainable development goals. Diplomats and advocacy organizations use the data for strategic planning and also monitoring in specific countries where they're working. And the media have been using the V-Dem data to speak to larger trends related to democracy and regime type. Also, a final group that uses the data are obviously scholars. So some have said V-Dem is really the gold standard now for measuring democracy or regime type. So we see a lot of publications coming out where V-Dem data are either used as technically the dependent variable to explain developments where you get a certain type of regime type, or are being used technically as the independent variable, where you're looking at the impact of regime type on particular outcomes like corruption or air pollution, things like that. And just to give you briefly two examples of concretely of how the data can be used. So we know that globally we're experiencing an autocratization trend, and that's definitely something that's very useful to monitor globally across time and also to monitor in particular countries. So one thing I was interested in looking at is whether we're seeing decline in both subnational and national election quality. And this graph goes back to 1900. If you look at the far right, though, you're going to see the contemporary data. The pink line is the freeness and fairness of national elections, and the black line is the freeness and fairness of subnational elections. You'll see we're starting to see a dip in the freeness and fairness of national elections, but not subnational elections yet. And these are global averages. We know that in terms of the autocratization trend from analysis of the V-Dem data, that the things that were attacked first and declined first in countries were things like judicial and legislative constraints, freedom of expression, and now we're just starting to see the erosion of free and fair elections in countries with autocratization trends. Also looking at a specific example, Hungary here. Again, in this case, the black dots represent national elections, the individual national elections that have been held. You can see over the last decade, there's been a decline in quality. The lower the points on the graph, the weaker, the less free and fair the elections. But subnational election freeness and fairness is still staying very high, actually very free and fair, which is good news. So by looking at data in a variety of ways, we can get global pictures, we can get pictures across time, and we can also look at individual countries. And I didn't do this here so much, but you can drill down to individual indicators too. So we could see when freeness and fairness of elections has dropped at the national level in Hungary, is it because of rigging of ballot boxes, or is it because of intimidation of candidates, for example? So those give you some examples of who is using the data and how they're using the data.
Super, thank you so much. Paolo, what's your take on this question?
Yes, so I mean, from what I've seen so far, I mean, our data has been used mainly in scholarly research. I hope, and I guess my colleagues do as well, we hope that will be useful to practitioners as well. And what I can say, we are very happy. We would be very happy to work with practitioners if there is any way in which our data can help, on the ground, address problems. We are very happy to do that.
Super, thank you. Alexander?
Well, just to put it in one sentence, what the Local Autonomy Index actually is, that it is a tool. It is a empirically based tool to understand in a very comprehensive way how local autonomy works, how it varies, and how it develops over time. So in that sense, it's been used also in academic circles, and literature has mentioned that the Local Autonomy Index is one of the preferable indexes to measure decentralization. Again, we're always looking to more improvement, and we provide this index as I said, as a tool. So if people want to assess their own respective countries or other countries, well, the framework is here, so they're free to use it, and so that it includes more countries, because that's always the ideal here, is to include more countries and to provide more developments and more details. But also outside of academia, definitely, just name a few examples. I mean, the European Commission has used the Local Autonomy Index in their cohesion reports on the state of subnational and local governance in their member states, but also partners such as the OECD have definitely used the Local Autonomy Index. And so also, well, with this webinar, we hope that we actually reach out to more people that and that this sparks interest, and that our index can be used as a springboard to further research on local autonomy.
Well, I see in the Q&A function, we're getting questions that will drive us into discussions of what's the difference between an indicator and a prescription. But before we get to those, I wanted to invite our two discussants, Philip Gonzalez and Benjamin Oliete, to join us and reflect on what you've been hearing. And so maybe I'll start with Philip, you're on the left on my screen. Welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying up so late.
No problem, Chaz, and thank you so much for the opportunity, everyone. And let me say what a wonderful experience it's been to listening to all the different work that's going on. I had a number of thoughts and questions too as a discussant. And they were related to the kind of work that the forum does and many of us here do when it comes to the application of some of the comparative knowledge that we gather from decentralized and federal countries. Particularly when we come into development assistance work and supporting sort of reform and advances in mature decentralized systems. And there's often that interface and dynamics between the political, the economic, and the social. And I'm wondering, do some of these indices, do you feel that they are beneficial in capturing some of the policy outcomes towards better services for citizens? If we think about some of the transition that countries like Philippines and Nepal have undertaken, they're often done because they're trying to address some kind of conflict or some sort of demand for better services. So I'm wondering, how do these tools support those sort of questions that are coming from policymakers? The other questions that I had, and I understand a bit of Paolo's work where we talk about a sectoral focus, and I'm wondering, can you then pinpoint some of those policy wins and perhaps failures in the work that you're doing as well, because I think that's very important, as well as some of the human factors that go on. When we work in countries, like I mentioned, Philippines and Nepal and other places, we often speak to political leaders about case studies or the stories of the transition. And I noted from all of your work that there's been some sort of historical context that you capture things. And I think that's very useful to some of the work that we need to explain to people when they're undertaking their own transition. Also, another 2 points, and then I should probably pause and leave some time for Benjamin. Within the scholarly work that's done, there's often pointed to the virtues of federalism and decentralized governance around them being laboratories for innovation. And have some of your indices and research pointed to some of those obvious results, or can you say definitively, yes, decentralization is a good system of governance to support this thinking? And then lastly, I will also ask another question. Is the role of cities? We see more and more, of course, the important work that cities are doing around the world, and where they are placed within federal and decentralized systems can sometimes be a bit complicated. And are you able to measure the role that cities have in these systems as well? And then I'll have some other questions, but I did want to ask Kelly specifically, because of the work she's doing, can you tell us which is the greatest democracy on earth? That's enough for me. I'll leave it there. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
So Benjamin, have you got a question that says overarching?
Yeah, sure. I tried to be quick, and thanks for having me, and thanks for all the inputs. Very interesting, very enriching. I already learned a lot. So just to make things a little bit more complicated, a few questions and thoughts from my side. So as a perspective from a practitioners network, international development organizations, we are always concerned with the question how to translate this into practice. And there's this one question, which is already also being addressed, but I really like the V-Dem approach on this inclusiveness, on collecting the data. But sometimes it seems, to play the devil's advocate, that this sometimes just is an academic exercise. And maybe the question is, how do you maybe have the motivations and interests of key actors also addressed and taken into account of this whole process of data collection and discussing it, but also on the conversation after this. Also, what's always useful is not only to have this data and data sets, but also if this is accompanied by a working system. So not only handbooks and guidance notes, but we are always interested in having examples of the use of the data and showcase how this data are useful in practice to get in conversations with donors, but also with local partners. I would also be interested, since you all have different perspectives and different indicators and having different results on different questions, but is it possible to interlink and compare all these different data that you're gaining and get a bigger picture of this? Or maybe this is the point where the Logica framework from our LPSA colleagues comes in. also a question which was already posed in the Q&A, how do you address the failures? So the communication of having data sets of countries who are not performing very well, but how do you get this into conversation, and what are your thoughts on that? And maybe last but not least, I would stop there with one eye on the clock. So there's also this question of not only having this more, maybe sometimes, again, to play the devil's advocate, top-down or more academic global north to global south conversation, but also to include maybe community-based monitoring systems. So have this compared or more a holistic approach of not only having this one side, but also having civil society, community-based monitoring, feeding in information and results, and using your data to keep their local governments and their national governments accountable. And this is why we as DALOG also want to foster the dialogue between the civil society, local governments, and the international development actors. And I think I'll leave it there. Very interesting. Thank you very much.
A lot of good questions. I'm going to work my way across the screen in reverse order, though, and start with Alexander. Can pick your question, or if you've got, you don't need to answer every one of them, but
yeah, I'll try and answer a few of these questions to the extent where the Local Autonomy Index is actually a relevant tool to use to answer these questions. So regarding Philip's questions, I did notice something about capturing changes in various policy sectors. Well, we can't really look with our index. You can't really look into decisions on what policies are executed. But what we can see is in what policy sectors do municipalities actually have partial or full responsibility? In what sectors can they actually act? Can they act on health, on education, on public transport? So in this sense, you could look at the margins that they have to act in these specific sectors. So changes in scoring would mean that their frame, their margin has been broadened or lessened in some cases as well. You can observe certain trends of recentralization, but to capture changes in actual policies, that's not something that would be provided by the Local Autonomy Index. Then for regarding the local units as laboratories for innovation, well, if you have a country that has high local autonomy in the fullest sense of the index, with high legal protection, with high political discretion, a large policy scope, the financial autonomy, organizational autonomy, non-interference by the higher level, and to have access to higher levels in the sense of a degree of influence, well, then this is a great place to look at this as a laboratory for innovation and see if the impact on policy outcomes and on performance changes at the local level where these municipalities have high autonomy, and to compare with impacts at the central level. Now, on the role of cities, I mean, we would have loved to have specific data on the differences between urban and rural communities, and especially on bigger cities. That is not something that for now can be measured, but it's definitely something we would aspire to in maybe hopefully a third iteration of the Local Autonomy Index. To move on to Benjamin's questions, regarding the practitioner's point of view and policy recommendation. On policy recommendations, the index here is not really the best tool to file for policy recommendations. What it can recommend is in what areas should autonomy be increased, or what components should be worked on. So to provide a concrete example of the use of data, if we see that at the fiscal level, decentralization is not high enough, and that the local communities want to implement solutions, and that they have the political power, let's say they have the discretion, but they don't have the resources, well, our measurements provide a certain way, a certain score, and that they can use as a sort of recommendation that, okay, well, you have everything that is needed. The only thing that is missing is more financial autonomy. So if you can put in place the legal institutional reforms necessary, then that would improve things at the local level. Linking and comparing data is actually interesting, just you're asking this question, because in my own personal research, I do look at some of the effects and impacts of local autonomy, and we are also looking at local democracy. So in a certain sense, I was already familiar with the V-Dem data set, because this is all work in progress, so there's no precise results here, but we have seen some correlations with our LAI data and data on the performance of service delivery or on local democracy. But again, these are all areas that need to be explored in more detail, but definitely the idea here was to be able to compare these various comprehensive data sets. And how to address failures, to end with the questions. Well, we can only see changes in scores, so we can only see changes in the general situation, or on a component level, on a variable level. But again, seeing and using the rich documentation and seeing at what level, at what legal reform could be implemented into in order to assure maybe higher autonomy, that could then lead to addressing policy failures or other difficulties. Again, we're not here to propose any solutions, but we're here to provide a sort of a benchmark or a framework that helps assess issues regarding local autonomy in these various countries. Thank you very much. I haven't been too long.
Go ahead, Paulo.
So I mean, I'm sort of following very much on on what Alexander said. So in a way, our data don't address specifically, the question of what works, what doesn't work. I mean, they in terms of the point that Philip was making in terms of policy failure, policy success. I mean, we don't do that. I mean, in a way, we can, we provide the indicators on the sort of institutional policy side of it, then to link it to possible, failures or success. So in a way, we made that sort of study possible. We haven't done it, ourselves. And I mean, for example, one aspect that we have found in our work is, for example, the diversity in control of natural resources. For example, we have found across federation, you see a lot of diversity in terms of whether natural resources are, fully centralized, are controlled by the federal government or controlled by the units, and that's an interesting finding where you don't, on other policy areas we find a lot of convergence. Among countries on this, we don't find that, and so that then you can look at what the consequences of that have been, and so start addressing the questions that Philip was asking, and similarly, for example, for fiscal autonomy, fiscal decentralization, there is a lot of diversity across countries, and there again you can learn interesting lessons there. I mean, in terms of policy change over time, I mean, as Alexander said, absolutely. I mean, you can do that with our data. Again, we haven't focused specifically on from a policy perspective, but if you want, the information is there. So you can trace the evolution of policies across countries and over time, certainly with our data. And again, just to echo Alexander again, I mean, in terms of integrating data, absolutely. I mean, in a way, we are doing, we are looking at different aspects of, what is obviously a complex, problematic as it were. So we have used also, V-Dem data in our research, and as I said, that we haven't looked at the, the state local level, which is what Alexander do. So I mean, in principle, there is certainly a lot of scope for synergies and combining data to to get a fuller picture of what is going on. And in terms of global north and global south, again, absolutely. Well, we are trying to do it to an extent in our project. As I said, in the second phase, we look at a new set of federations that they are in the Global South. We have fully integrated, experts from the area. Even for the first phase, we had a workshop in India, for example, and so on. So we are very, very open to integrating different perspectives and not sort of imposing a one size fits all sort of approach. And in particular, last point is that when we move from looking at those, if you want, traditional federations to this new set of federations, we have adapted the methodology. We adapted the framework in a way, to make it appropriate for this particular set of countries. So I very much welcome, the call to try to integrate these perspectives.
Kelly, anything to add to that that perspective?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for your questions and comments, Philip and Benjamin. In terms of policy outcomes, the V-Dem data are useful to answer the how and why questions. So what is it about the political institutions and the political practices that leads to bad policy or good policy outcomes? So because the data set's so disaggregated, you can really get detailed and see what is driving a negative result. So for example, what is driving higher excess deaths during the COVID pandemic, or what is driving higher levels of corruption? So we don't have the policy data themselves, but by using other existing data, we can explain how it is that the political institutions and political practices are predisposing countries to particularly good or bad outcomes. And V-Dem's done some of that work on behalf of practitioners. We have a series of briefs out now looking at policy outcomes like education success, economic inequality, things like that. Just short little papers that show what is driving good and bad outcomes in those areas. And those are available on the V-Dem website. So along those lines too, I think I already addressed Benjamin's question about failure. So you can get an answer, I think, to the how and why do certain policies end up being less successful. In terms of innovation, same thing. I mean, you can look to see, you look at countries that have introduced gender quotas and you see, do you get different outcomes? So the V-Dem data, again, looking at changes in political institutions and political practices over time. And that's a nice test to see if you get better policies. So in that sense, you can use the data to, I think, get at the laboratory question. V-Dem doesn't have city data. We don't have any plans to do city level data. Our data are country level. To Philip's tongue-in-cheek question about what is the greatest democracy on earth, it depends on which you want to emphasize, which dimension of democracy. So are you interested in a particular participatory system, for example, or a particular egalitarian system? And it's very possible using the basic V-Dem graphing tools that we put on online to look and get those answers. Just finally, to comment on Ben's really useful question about involving the community in the collection of data. We very much involved key actors down to country level community activists, people like that, in terms of designing the V-Dem indicators. So we really wanted to make sure that local knowledge about what was going on the ground and local needs, as well as international organization needs, informed what data we collected. But in terms of getting the actual information, we're interested in more objective information. That's why we use experts. In total, we have about 4,000 country experts who contribute, and they are not politically engaged, and that's intentional. So we wanted to accept an expert who is also running for office or is a part of a political party leader or something like that. And our concern is that, if you ask about how freely can you start a non-governmental organization to a non-governmental organization leader, they have information, but it may be, very biased by anger, for example. Or if you ask a local government leader about how free and fair elections are, and that, person's an incumbent, that may be biased too. So again, we really drew on the global community, the local communities, to develop the design of or to help us to inform us about how to design V-Dem. But in terms of the data, we try to get it from the most objective sources. And to reciprocate, we have, as I've mentioned already, we have easy to use online tools. We've done reports to share with the community. The V-Dem team's gone out and done workshops in countries around the world for scholars about how to use the data. And we also do commissioned reports for different organizations that don't want to tackle the 28.4 million data points in V-Dem, which is understandable. Thanks again for your questions.
Philip, Benjamin, those answers prompt any other comments from you, or your questions actually correlate a good bit with some of the questions we've been collecting in the Q&A, and I don't know if participants can see the Q&A, but there's some really good points being made, and I wanted to turn to those, but not before I gave you a chance to follow up with anything you want to. Philip or Benjamin?
I didn't have anything further to add. I think we could go to the other questions. I don't want to hog the time. I feel like we've got a lot of good answers there. Yeah. But the only thing I would add is I noted, particularly in Kelly's work, that it's a strong focus, if I understood correctly, on political science dimension. And have you accounted for the impact of economic and perhaps legal influences on some of the processes? And lastly, Kelly, I'm so sorry to sort of not pick on you at all, but I noted that you did some work on the subnational elections, and your comment around there's no dip. Can you ascribe why that is? Because that would be an indicator that democracy is stronger at the subnational level, which is a really powerful and interesting point. That's it from me, promise. Thank you.
Benjamin, any other points?
I think Philip's questions really sound interesting. Let's get into this. I think that's okay. That's fine.
Super. Kelly, if I know there's a book to be written on this, but if you've got a short answer, I want to make sure we give some airtime to our audience questions.
Yeah, so thanks for your questions, Philip. So in my own research, and also generally political scientists, when they're trying to look at whether there's an impact of political institutions and practices, for example, on a particular policy outcome, they're definitely going to also include in their analysis economic factors, other social factors as well. Legal factors are captured already in V-Dem, as well as the de facto experiences. And V-Dem actually facilitates that. So in addition, in our data set, in addition to our own indicators, we've put sort of the standard commonly used indicators for, country wealth, state capacity, things like that. So it's kind of one-stop shopping. You can pull the V-Dem data set and then also have what you need to make sure you're looking at those other potential influences. In terms of those subnational elections, I agree with you, that's good news if we see globally as this autocratization trend likely progresses, unfortunately, whether the subnational elections hold up, that would be great. It's not something I've investigated so far, just something I've noticed. But we're really seeing at the, it's really national leaders who are taking an active role in autocratizing their countries. So it may be that the subnational level just isn't on their radar yet. We also know from looking at history, there can be subnational leaders and subnational activists who are holdouts. So we may see, further contention with the national and subnational leaders as autocratization trends continue. But yeah, I encourage everyone to keep monitoring what's going on. There are a lot of interesting things. Thank you.
I've got a question that I hope is not too much antagonistic, but it is prompted by Peter Vaz has a question in the Q&A about how receptive country leaders are to these metrics and their scores. And that relates to a lot of the donor effort on localizing things now as well. But my perspective on it has been when I challenged several years worth of students when I was teaching about local government to name a single country that had decentralized in order to improve democracy or improve service delivery. Because my observation is that, as I think one of you made the point that people decentralize to resolve some other conflict, either an actual conflict or a political debate that drives them, and that the momentum of those debates doesn't disappear when we change the intergovernmental structures. People have the same interest obtained, and so that oftentimes the mayor or the governor or whoever, the central official, has still got the old conflict that predates the existing structure, is the first thing they worry about in the morning, not about how do we improve service delivery or make our local decisions more inclusive of, particularly of women and other minorities. So I guess my question for you, picking up on what Peter and some other people in the Q&A have raised, is how do you, you're capturing issues about governance and democratic practices. We haven't done RCTs or anything to tie these directly to service outcomes, but how do you take account of these historical, I guess it's political, but social conflicts that lead to the governance outcomes that, those of us from outside want to attach all these good attributes to. This is services closer to the people and more voice for local people, but that's often not what our local counterparts have at the front of their minds. And so this may be, work ahead for all of us, but to me, it's been a challenge to, when you're talking to people, the mayor of X or the sole council member from a minority party of some sort. Any thoughts on this? Volunteers.
Well, if I may jump in, I mean, just to, in our work, we have tried to sort of explain why we see the patterns that we have measured. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, that's not, is never easy. But, we have tried, and I mean, as you said, there are a range of motivations why political actors engage in centralization or decentralization. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't want to go too much into detail now, but in a sense, we are trying to do that. We are trying to do that, and of course, over time, you see obviously the context changing, mm-hmm. and so then that's why you have these sometimes quite dramatic dynamics, over the long run. But it's certainly true that the motivation behind these steps are very varied, and I mean, perhaps I wouldn't be entirely sort of cynical in saying they're never to improve democracy. I think in many cases they actually were, or at least was a motivation. The idea, for example, in take a country like Brazil, for example. When it became, obviously, it started life not as a federation, and became a federation as a way of, was going hand in hand with becoming a republic. So arguably you could say, perhaps not everyone, but certainly there was a desire to make the country more democratic and better governed. So yes, conflict is obviously a strong motivation, often many parts of the world. But I would be perhaps as slightly more positive in the sense that sometimes there is a desire to improve, and for example, let's say if you take European countries, you look at countries like Italy or Spain, coming out of obviously authoritarian periods, and having regional governments, having local governments with higher autonomy was an important aspect of becoming more democratic. So
yes, I guess maybe a more polite way to ask my question of all of you would be, are there examples of countries working to improve their scores on your metrics? So does the external judgment or scoring motivate local actors to behave differently? we have examples, and that's not necessarily always a good thing. The World Bank's doing business indicators, countries would, reduce the number of days to register a business and, jump up the league tables, but, without really improving the ecosystem for local entrepreneurship. So I don't know that this is the only metric to worry about, but it's an example of the fact that people locally are paying attention to the similar framework.
I think in terms of varieties of democracy, because the data are being used by global and national actors who can put pressure on governments, they're likely helping to the extent that local and national government leaders are receptive to making change. But I think, we have problems with this issue anyway, right? Independent of which data national and local government leaders are being shown, they have incentives to not improve. I will say, so I don't have actual evidence of a connection, except that I can tell you that national government leaders have approached V-Dem to complain about their scores. So we have that going on. And of course, we don't change them because it's based on country expert knowledge. So people are paying attention to these types of data and indicators. But I think it's hard to say definitively how motivating they are.
Alexander, any thoughts?
To provide maybe a more specific example of how it's actually been used, I know that in cases like I just mentioned, the European Commission does use our index in reports. Now, okay, this is only information, but these reports are then read by delegations and dignitaries of the member states. So there is some kind of a transfer of knowledge, but then also in a more specific aspects, I believe that, well, the Council of Europe do have monitoring reports on how well the European Charter of Local Self-Government is implemented. And our index is a more of a quantifiable way of showing how well these charters are implemented, because it is one condition of being a member of a member state of the Council of Europe is there's a certain number of treaties or principles you have to adhere to. So in order to verify to what extent this is respected, well, our index does provide a certain an easier way of assessing the situation of multi-level governance and local autonomy more specifically in these member states. So there is a certain institutional impact for sure.
One of the questions we've received is whether the things like the European Charter are the basis for your construction of your indicators, or the reverse question would be, having done the indicator work, are there suggestions you would have to change the emphases in various parts of that charter? Whether you've thought about that. This is for you, Alexander.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I'm in a position to say how the charter should be, how the charter should be changed, but definitely our variables and our components of local autonomy are all based on a broad review of literature, but also on other decentralization indexes that have preceded us, or like you said, well, some of the components are definitely very much based on the European Charter of Local Self-Government. This is also due to the fact that the mandate that was provided to us by the European Commission does say, well, we base ourselves on the European Charter. So, I mean, the research has been framed in a certain way, in a very Eurocentric way. But with this new 2.0 iteration of the index, we do see that the methodology can be applied to other countries. So in our sense, the index does travel very well. Now, we would want to see how this expands to more countries to see if this claim can still be upheld later on. But for the moment, it does seem to work in this sense.
We're running up on our time, and I've got other good questions, but let me ask, so I hesitate to not work my way down this list. One of those relates to the fact that in several episodes, the questioner raises the question in Nigeria, where the generals seem to be more in favor of decentralization than the politicians. And I know in Pakistan's episodes of local governance, the provincial leaders and the central military officials differed. But to the extent that not all of you address countries that aren't necessarily have the military in charge of things, but and maybe that's just gets wrapped up in some autocracy measure. But any thoughts on this issue of the varied interest in fragmenting or not fragmenting local political entities?
Yeah,
or am I describing the content for a next webinar?
Just very quickly, we came across them. So Nigeria and Pakistan are two of the countries we looked at. And so these are both countries, of course, they experience military rule. And what we have found is that, sometimes rulers, they favor local governments versus provincial or state governments. Provincial and state governments are potentially a threat for the centers. Local governments typically are not. So they like to play the decentralization card, as it were, say, wow, we have decentralized local government. But they decentralize local government by weakening the intermediate level of government, because that's the one that potentially is a counterbalance for the centers. So that's a sort of game that has been observed by, to be honest, by a number of people, including ourselves, in a few countries. So we need, when we think of decentralization, we need to think that that is potentially, a game that people play.
We're really running out of time. Kelly, if you've got a quick point, I've got a last question I want to ask each of you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, beyond those cases, we can see that how national leaders, whether they're military or civilian, strategically use subnational governments to their advantage. So we have scenarios where it's useful for national leaders to have pockets in some subnational units of lack of democracy, and in others to have pockets of democracy. We've also seen national leaders introduce subnational elections to their what they think is a part of a good strategy, although it actually often leads to democratic transition at the national level. Anyway, so there are a lot of different scenarios that we've seen in the data.
So my last question for each of you is, if somebody in our audience today handed me $1 million to spend on improving data on local government indices, would each of you have a proposal in your drawer you could send me on what you would do to extend, enlarge, test, whatever your indices? What's the next step for you? What's your cutting edge? And Paulo, I'll start with you, since you've been in the middle of my previous runs.
Okay, thank you. So we are, as I mentioned, we are now doing a second phase. We almost finished that. So that's the immediate sort of next step. And then what we plan to do is also to integrate the two data sets that we'll have. So we'll have annual measures for 11 federations across 200 years. So that's the sort of immediate sort of step. And then later on would be interesting also to expand this to non-federal countries, to unitary countries, and so to integrate unitary and federal, and to look at these dynamics across a larger universe of political systems.
Thank you. Kelly?
So I did consider at one point doing a sort of a sub-project within V-Dem of taking a small number of countries and gathering data for individual subnational units within them. But I actually think the best use of additional funding is to make sure that the V-Dem data set continues to be updated. And it's less expensive than it was to start it, but the annual updates do cost money too. So if anyone has found the V-Dem data useful, it genuinely has a million or whatever to partner with V-Dem for updates, that's very helpful. And I think the most useful, and from my perspective, for my work, the most useful purpose for funds. We do have we have secured funding to ensure updates into the foreseeable future, but it will continue to be an issue to make sure we can update the data. It's really, really important to policymakers, democracy advocates, and scholars to have those updates, I think, and also to be able to go back in time and look at trends. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Alexander.
Well, the two biggest limits to our project were definitely time and money related. So if these limits were to be removed, we could definitely reassess the entire set of countries, expand to more countries, go even further back to increase the time period that is covered. But we could go into more detail in these all these different indicators and all these different policy sectors. But most importantly, we could assess, like I mentioned before, urban-rural differences, look into more in-depth into every single municipality of every single country, notify maybe differences between municipalities in the same subnational units, or even in across these subnational units, look at different asymmetries in the configurations, whether they're institutional, organizational, financial, or otherwise. There's so much more that can be explored on the basis of our framework, but the only thing needed would be to have more people involved, to include more countries, to broaden the perspective, whether it's the time perspective or the geographical perspective. But we are definitely ready for the next steps with our index, for sure.
Okay, my dogs are about to bark, but I'm going to plunge ahead anyway. We've run out of time, and I wanted to, before I thank our speakers and our discussants, to alert you to the LPSA's next webinar, which is on the direction of decentralization in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which is a series of sessions occurring across November 7th, 8th, and 9th. We're still finalizing the speakers, but if you pay attention to our website, decentralization.net, you can see those details as they emerge and register. But I've had such a fun time talking to each of our panelists today as we prepared for this and reading their materials, which we're linked in the announcement for this, and we'll have in the follow-up emails, because there's just so much interesting and important work going on. So Kelly McCann, Paolo Dardanelli, and Alexander Bastian, thank you so much for your ongoing work and also for being with us today. Benjamin Gonzalez and Philip Gonzalez, Benjamin Oliete, you're not interchangeable. Thank you so much. But most importantly, of course, thank you to our audience members. A lot of good questions in the chat that we couldn't get to, and I'm going to figure out a way to get those into some follow-up material of some sort. And then thank you to Jamie and Myrna and others at LPSA for supporting us as we had what I hope was for others, as it was for me, such an interesting discussion, and just a start, more to come. I think with that, we are concluded. Thank everybody for being here this morning, this afternoon, this evening, and we will look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much.